Welcome to Deep 404. There's talk that the deal that US President Joe Biden is allegedly putting together in the Senate, trying to organise in the Senate, to resolve the crisis in Texas at the moment, where the Texas National Guard and state troopers are stopping the federal border guards from accessing areas of the border with Mexico in order to remove razor wire, concertina wire that has been placed there, where the state of Texas has made an attempt to secure its own state border. This is an activity which is by legislation to be carried out by the federal government. So it's to be carried. Enforcement of the southern border of the US is meant to be carried out by the Federal Border Patrol. Texas is suggesting that Biden's administration and the Border Patrol aren't doing enough. They have called that they are suffering an invasion and taking matters into their own hands, and this is causing a big stir at the moment. Texas, the governor, Greg Abbott there, a letter has now been signed by 25 other Republican state governors where they are all expressing their support for his position against the federal government. The United States Supreme Court voted earlier this week in a 5-4 ruling, which says that the Federal Border Patrol must be allowed to go to the border and resume their activities there. Greg Abbott and the Texans are rejecting that. Democratic politicians are calling for the federalization of the National Guard. Now, the name National Guard makes it sound like it is already a federal organization. In the United States, the National Guard are actually state-based militias. So each state has its own National Guard element. So in Texas, the National Guard are Texans operating under the governor. However, because they are a military organization within the United States, ultimately their control would roll up to Joe Biden as the commander-in-chief. Anyhow, all of this is also tied into the funding for Ukraine and for Israel from the federal government. And right now, that funding of $64 billion for Ukraine and $16 billion for Israel is being held up. It's being held up because in the United States, you have two houses, a bicameral parliament. You have the Senate and you have the House. The Senate is putting together the bill which will talk about the funding and what's going to happen and how it will be funded, and the House needs to approve it. So right now, the Senate is working to come up with something, but Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the House, has said that the bill in its current form, reportedly, Johnson has said it's dead in the water when it arrives on his desk. Doesn't go far enough to give him what he wants, and he wants concrete action taken on the southern border to secure the border, to stop the influx of undocumented migrants. Mike Johnson has no concern about documented migration. Their concern is the thousands of people each day coming into America, of which the Americans have zero information about who these people are. They're coming in at the rate of millions a year, 3 or 4 million a year, it's projected under Joe Biden's rule. So 12 million over the 4-year expanse of his term of undocumented people coming into the United States through the southern border. Obviously, there are humanitarian reasons for why you would want to let some of these people in. I think most of the politicians, at least the Republican politicians, are saying, yes, we agree with that. We would just like to know who they are and bring them in through a process. We're not saying just shut the border to everyone. What they are saying is we want to remove the risk of unfriendly elements entering into the United States, and we have no idea about them or where they are going or what they're doing. Anyhow, so this is all tied up together. Reports that I was reading last night are that the bill in its current shape is being put together such that if, in a course of a week, the average number of undocumented migrants who enter the country is more than 5,000 per day, So if you're getting more than 35,000 people a week, then with this new legislation, Joe Biden will be given special authorization powers to be able to say, we've got to close the border to stop that. Now, 5,000 people a day. Obviously, this has to somehow be policed and estimated at the border. And if Biden didn't really want it to be policed too closely, surely people would make mistakes and more could get through before they were counted as reaching that 5,000 total. But that 5,000 a day, if you let that go for a year, that's 1.8 million people coming into the country with no documentation, no one knowing who they are, anything about them at all. Almost 2 million. And so for this reason, and the fact that Joe Biden is going to get this legislation that he can call an emergency situation and close the border when he wants, I think that Mike Johnson is going, no, this isn't going to fly. You're halving the number of people that are coming in. You're not stopping the problem or fixing the problem. And he's probably hesitant to give Joe Biden any special emergency powers of any sort as well. So that seems to be dead in the water if that arrives today for Speaker Mike Johnson. We'll find out more about that. But this is growing into a problem within the United States. I mean, I guess you imagine, looking at the Western media, if this sort of thing were happening in Russia at the moment, where half of Russia was siding with one oblast and all the other Russian oblasts were going, no, we don't side with them. It would be major front page news. Russia seems to be relatively stable compared to what is looking like a fracture in the fabric of the United States. There are lines being drawn along the political party lines. The Republican governors support this state's action against the federal government, while the Democratic governors reject it and are saying, instead, we need to now federalize the National Guard so they're no longer under state control. We can't have these states having this power to do this sort of thing. This is fractious for the United States. Anyhow, that's going on, amongst other things. The big news this week, and tragic news, the shooting down of the IL-76, the Aleutian 76 cargo transport plane, massive aircraft, which had 6 crew and 3 Russian guards and 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war who were being returned to Ukraine. It was shot down with, I believe, a loss of all life on the plane. Just some comments from President Putin, his position on this. He has said, the main intelligence department of the Ukrainian army knew we were taking 65 servicemen there. I don't know whether they did it on purpose or by mistake, out of thoughtlessness, but they did it. He has also, President Putin, I said, has reportedly in an television interview, said that they believe the weapon or the air defense system and missiles used to shoot down the plane were either French or American, and that they're doing analysis on the retrieved wreckage of that air defense missile, and that they will know shortly as to the origin of that. And that doesn't look good for either France or the US. There is reports from a Telegram channel, a Ukrainian Telegram channel, where they talk a little bit about this. I'll just give, again, this is just, I read these because these are coming from an insider Ukrainian position. So this isn't a Western position, which I think makes often their reports interesting. The incident with the downed Aleutian only worsened Ukraine's position. When it becomes known that the Russian military plane was shot down by a Western air defense system, then even more problems will begin for Ukraine. And this is what President Putin has been alluding to. To the point that Putin will have all the trump cards to accuse the West of attacking Russia, and with such actions they are provoking a third world war. In Europe and the USA they are very afraid of this case, and everyone will happily abandon Kiev in order to save themselves. Plus, Putin will have every reason to even declare war on Kiev, which he is in no hurry to do. So, I mean, this aligns with what I've been saying. I did an earlier video this morning. One, it's called NATO Says Prepare for War, but why? It's on X. It's also on YouTube. And in there, I'm talking about exactly what this Insider Ukrainian channel is corroborating here, that Putin is in no hurry to declare war on Kiev. Yet If you listen to NATO, the Swedish administration, the UK Western press, Germany and Polish press releases, it seems that they feel that President Putin of Russia is about to launch an attack on those nations now, and they need to get ready. If you're interested in that, go and have a look at that, because I've asked some questions about why that might be the case and give some suggestions on why that might be the case. In some reporting I saw just this morning, again, troubles for Ukraine, not just on the battlefront, but if this reporting is correct, reports that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence is undergoing some internal scrutiny and raids, perhaps on Alexander Liev, the head of the Department of Military Tactical Policy at the Ministry of Defence, for what is being reported as being large-scale embezzlement to do with ammunition. The figures that they are talking about in this reporting are large. It has a B at the end of it. I don't know if that's in Havanas or if that is in dollars. Either way, it seems as though there may have been some large-scale embezzlement, which is something which has been reported many times about the activities of some elements of the Ukrainian military. Very tempting, being given all these weapons from foreign nations, expensive new NATO weapons, and reportedly no governance over where they go. I think if you were to ask the American Pentagon where all their weapons have gone, could they provide a list? They would put their hands up and say, we've got no idea. They went to Ukraine. That's where they went. There have been reports during the last 2 years of fighting that there have been weapons from Ukraine being siphoned off, being sold on the black market to other areas around the world. And that, in fact, some of the weapons used against the Israelis by Hamas may even have originated in Ukraine. So it seems like, if this reporting is true, as I say, that there may be some big news in terms of this corruption and embezzlement going on within the Ukrainian military. And again, this is a bad sign for Ukraine, not just on the battlefront, but these sort of things you don't want coming out, leaking out in the press. It diminishes people's impression and belief in the military in Ukraine. President Putin has also, in an interview, he was talking, I think he was actually talking to some students, and I imagine this is intentional, but he has mentioned that Russia has 617,000 soldiers deployed in Ukraine. He doesn't often talk about those sort of numbers like that, but if this was correct, this does corroborate the idea that Russia has been increasing its numbers in Ukraine. These 617 soldiers, no doubt, are not all at the front line, but they will be in Ukraine, able to enable the continued rapid revolving of frontline troops. So instead of ending up in a situation where you have guys on the front line for weeks and months at end and they are just being destroyed physically and mentally, some reports I saw yesterday that a large percentage of the Ukrainian frontline forces are considered to be suffering extreme mental stress and duress, and that's moving to the point of mental illness. An example was one guy who has said, the success I've had in the last 10 months has been that my hands have stopped shaking all the time, but that's now come back again. You can just imagine what it must be like. But Russia, 617,000 troops there, means lots of them can sit at the back. They're well fed, they're prepared, their morale is high, they've got training going on, and they are rotated in quickly so that those frontline guys don't lose hope and morale. They don't get just burnt out and wasted away and just replaced and just become a meat grinder at the front. They go in, they fight, they're fresh, they fight well, they get pulled out and they get replaced, and so they're able to operate at a higher level. That's what this number of troops in Ukraine means for the Russians in this special military operation. Media Zona and the BBC, who I've spoken about before, because they are reporting and investigating upon a very interesting topic, which is the number of Russians that have been killed in this conflict, and they are doing it in a way which seems to be the most scientific way, quantitative way thus far that I've come across. They are going out and they are looking at things like obituaries and military reports and surfing social media for where Russian people are posting and saying, I've lost my husband or son, he has died. And so they can confirm these people have died. They are saying that the Russian military personnel killed since the start of the conflict, so that's nearly in 2 years, in that 2 years almost of fighting, 42,284. These are ones that they can confirm. That's killed. That's a lot. There's a lot of Russian men who have died. That's 20,000 a year, roughly. Now, these are the confirmed numbers, so surely the numbers will be somewhat higher than this. But I imagine they would be higher due to men who have been killed, whose bodies haven't been retrieved and are currently marked as being missing, that sort of thing. So maybe that number is 50,000 if you allow some excess there. I don't know. But it's certainly not 500,000. It's not an order of magnitude out. So maybe it's 40 to 50,000 or something like that. Ukrainian Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko, who is a former prosecutor general and ex-head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, he came out about a fortnight ago and has said, I think that we should name the number of dead Ukrainians. I know that they don't want this and it will be taken seriously. Yes, it will be a shock. We must honestly say that the 500,000 that they are now being talked about, if divided into months, is 30,000 a month. And then we will approximately understand what is happening at the front. So what he's saying, this Ukrainian Interior Minister, is that because reportedly General Zaluzhny has asked President Zelensky for 500,000 people to be mobilised, for 500,000 to be mobilised. He is suggesting that they are replacements for those who have been lost, and that means that they have lost 30,000 a month or 1,000 people a day, killed and wounded. Not just killed, but killed and wounded. Note that the Russian Ministry of Defence and their reporting over the last few months gives a figure which probably averages out closer to somewhere between 20 and 23,000 killed and wounded per month. So Ukrainian former prosecutor general suggesting 1,000 a day. The Russian Ministry of Defence reporting comes out somewhere between 500 and 700, occasionally getting up to 1,000 a day. But it's the Russian Ministry of Defence estimates are lower than what the Ukrainian former prosecutor general is suggesting is the likely figure. And I think that's interesting too. A lot of people obviously don't listen to the other side's numbers. They will be overinflated, and perhaps those Russian numbers are overinflated. But interestingly, they are less than what the Ukrainian former prosecutor general is suggesting that the Ukrainian losses are. Sergei Shoigu, who's the Russian defense minister, in late December of last year, 2023, so just a few weeks ago, he has claimed the Ukrainian army has lost more than 215,000 men killed and wounded in 2023 and 383,000 killed and wounded over the entire conflict. Now, again, he's saying a number of 383,000, which is less than the 500,000, which the Ukrainian former prosecutor general is suggesting might be the number. Again, I find this is interesting, that the Russian figures coming from the defense minister are lower than what's coming out of the Ukrainian parliament. I guess we'll find out one day what that number really is, But anyhow, in terms of the Ministry of Defence update from Russia, I use these because these numbers are at least consistent. We get them each day. They also provide a weekly summary, and you can go and verify some of the things that are reported, like some of the equipment in certain areas that's reported as being destroyed by the Russian Ministry of Defence. You can go onto Telegram channels and you can look for it. You can find that they're geolocated, so you can back some of this up. Where people ask me why I don't use the Ukrainian figures, and it's because I find the Ukrainian figures to be far less reliable. That's it. That's just why I don't. They just don't appear as reliable. The air defence reports are proven to be false. A lot of their reports around equipment that has been destroyed is often found to have been. Examples would be where it has been found to have been Ukrainian equipment instead of Russian equipment, or it may have been captured Russian equipment being used by the Ukrainians and then reported as being destroyed by the Ukrainians, when in fact it is a piece of equipment that has been perhaps lost but used, or it's old Soviet equipment which is being passed off as Russian when it's actually Ukrainian. Anyhow, for those reasons, I tend to find the Russian Ministry of Defence figures are more reliable. And as I say, now that we have this upper limit suggested by a Ukrainian politician, which is higher than what the Ministry of Defence of Russia is indicating, I feel that these numbers are ones which we can talk about, and they are not ones which are just wildly ridiculous. Anyhow, in the last 24 hours, in the Kupiansk direction, fighting around Sinkovka still and Terny. Now, Sinkovka is up near Kupiansk. It is an area which has been difficult for the Russians to capture because they are approaching from the east. Sinkovka is just on the foothills of this higher land, and it's forested higher land, and the Russians need to approach across the fields. I have yesterday seen some reporting that the Russians have had success in moving on Sinkovka. They were talking previously perhaps about looking to sort of encircle, go around the sides. I don't know what the tactic has been, but the reports are they are now having success there. Perhaps they have been able to move the Ukrainians off the higher ground in the forested areas that they have, infiltrate there perhaps. I don't know. Reports are that 25 Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded in yesterday's fighting in the Kupiansk region. Moving down to Krasny Liman, where the Russian center group of forces are operating. Around Chervenaya Dubrova and Yampolovka, fighting has been going on there. Also in Krovsk and around the Serebrantsky forestry area. This forestry is to the south and east of like where the Oskol River comes down. There's been heavy fighting in this forested area for some time. Reports are the Ukrainians have lost 100 troops in the last day of fighting and one D-20 howitzer. In the Donetsk region, around Shumy, Bogdanovka, Krasnoye, Klesheyevka and Andreevka, in these areas, the fighting has been focused in the last day. The Ministry of Defence reports 250 Ukrainian troops reportedly lost, killed or wounded, and one Akatsiya self-propelled artillery system has been destroyed. In South Donetsk region, around Priyutne and Makarovka, the reports here are that 115 Ukrainian troops have been lost and two Akatsiya self-propelled artillery systems. As we move further south into the west into Zaporozhye region, here the fighting has been around Rabotne. 20 Ukrainian troops reported killed or wounded. One Akatsiya self-propelled and one Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system lost. So two in the Zaporozhye region yesterday. And then finally, moving down to Kherson. In the Kherson region, 15 troops reportedly killed or wounded, Ukrainian troops. And the reports are 4 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery systems have been destroyed. Now, this means that in today's fighting, if these reports are correct, 525 Ukrainian servicemen have either lost their lives or been wounded seriously, enough to be taken out of the fighting. 10 artillery pieces reportedly destroyed, and of those 10, 9 of them self-propelled pieces. Now, this move to self-propelled pieces being destroyed by the Russians is something that I've seen increasing over the last couple of weeks. As I've mentioned, I haven't sat down and done a statistical analysis. I haven't grabbed these figures, pumped them into Excel and seen what the chart looks like. But my gut feel is that the Russians are picking off more and more self-propelled pieces for the Ukrainians at this stage, which may indicate that that's what's left. The Ukrainians don't have a whole heap of fixed pieces left. But regardless, if the Ukrainians are losing the mobile pieces, that's bad for them, because the mobile pieces are the ones which give you a tactical advantage. You can shoot and you can move somewhere else, and you can shoot and you can move someone else, and hopefully you can protect that self-propelled artillery piece. It's like having a big tank. But if they're being lost, then you're losing that ability to tactically maneuver and shoot your artillery. Instead, you're shooting from fixed locations, and fixed locations are easier to blow up than ones that are mobile. So on the front line, it's not good news for the Ukrainians yesterday, if this reporting is correct. The EU, the Guardian newspaper is reporting here that the EU is getting really worried about Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, so much so that reporting is that the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, has abandoned his plans to step down as the President, and he's doing that because there is a fear that the way the timing works and the rules of who would assume control if he were to step down now is that would fall to Viktor Orban. Now, right now, the EU is trying to figure out how it can perhaps enact Article 7 of the EU treaty to allow them to block Viktor Orban's voting. Viktor Orban doesn't want to vote on the EU giving 50 billion euros to Ukraine over the next 3 years. He's asking for some oversight on that, some governance, some understanding on what will happen to that money, where it will be spent, who it will be spent by, and that is not being required by the EU. And that for that reason, he's saying, nah, I'm not giving the money. Or Viktor Orban also is one of the few NATO members who seems to still be on a position, him and perhaps President Erdogan of Turkey and Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia seem to be those who still hold some ability to have a relationship with President Putin and have a conversation with him. I saw something earlier, I didn't note it down, but something along the lines of not a Serbian region Prime Minister talking about looking at normalising relations with Russia, with President Putin. Anyhow, so Orban, not particularly liked by the EU at the moment, certainly more on the side looking to restore relations with Russia and get out of this fight. Both Viktor Orban and Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia, as I mentioned in yesterday's video, they still receive Russian oil through Ukraine on the Druzhba pipeline, the Friendship pipeline. So that may also influence their position in that they wish to continue that oil flowing. They don't want to be fighting with Russia about that. Anyhow, because in the EU, there is a process that if the leader steps down, it can take some time, 6 months or so, before they determine the new president. What happens is that it's the person who will then assume control is the country that is holding the rotating presidency at that time. And this means that it could fall to Viktor Orban, who it looks like they would assume sort of a rotating presidency at that period of time if there wasn't a president in place. So that's their concern, that Orban, who the EU is struggling with and wanting to block his vote at the moment, he could become the president there of the European Council, which would be a challenge for the EU. For that reason, it seems as though Charles Michel will remain in his position for some period of time until that likelihood of Viktor Orban assuming the control will not be there anymore. There is talk, again, coming from a Ukraine channel which has connections, it seems, to the Ukrainian administration, and they are suggesting that the new US military plans being developed for Ukraine do not provide for the return of lost territories. And they're quoting this being written in the Washington Post. I didn't look at the Washington Post article, I've just seen the Ukrainian channel reporting on this. But if this is the case, which logically would be the case, the Americans know that the Russians aren't going to negotiate and give up the land that they've taken in this conflict. As much as President Zelensky might yell and shout about this and suggest that this needs to be done and that these peace negotiations need to happen and that Russia must be excluded and that the peace negotiation must start with all these lands being returned in the real world, that's not going to happen. The Americans understand this now, and the Ukrainian internal channels are now coming out with this with that understanding and recognising it as well. There are reports that the US wants to place nuclear weapons in the UK. They want to station some nuclear weapons in one of the Air Force bases, Lakenheath in Suffolk. This is the first time, apparently, in about 15 years since the US will have done that. And as I said in the earlier video that I did this morning, just go and have a look at that one. NATO says prepare for war, but why? In there, I'm talking about the fact that things like this are happening and this rhetoric is being ratcheted up in the West about, well, we need to get ready for war with Russia. NATO needs to get ready. Paris is suffering. Look, as I say, if you have your farmers in your country enacting blockades and protesting, then you've got real problems in your country. Like, this is just like a fundamental thing. It's like, if you fall on the concrete, you're going to hurt your knee. You know, it's kind of like physics. If the farmers are pissed off, you've got a problem, because the farmers are what sustain you. The farmers are generally real, pragmatic, sensible, conservative, hardworking people connected to the earth. If they say there's a problem, then there's a problem. So France is now apparently on the pointy end of having a blockade wrapped around Paris by the farmers. And this blockade, in the reporting I've seen this morning, is suggested to not be a 12 or 15-hour event, but a 5-day event at a minimum. They are really wanting to put the pressure on Paris. So a blockade by farmers of Paris means that within 2 days, the supermarket shelves start to get empty. Supermarkets stock, enough for about 2 days generally. They're replenishing every day. Obviously, fresh foods, fruit and vegetables, it's every day. Other things, it's every couple of days. Dried foods, it's twice a week as they start to run out. You stop that supply for a couple of days. Well, first of all, everyone in Paris now is reading this as running out to the supermarkets and is hoarding stuff. So they're all hoarding. So the supermarket shelves are probably already depleting. In a day or so, they will be empty. If it goes on for 5 days or more, then Paris is in a real problem. And President Macron has got real issues. He's now got to bring in the military to break up this protest from the farmers, or do something to listen to the farmers. Not a good spot. Not a good spot for him to be in. This is just an ongoing series of protests that have been happening in Paris for a number of months now. For whatever reason, France seems to have a good ability to suppress in media its protest problems. They don't seem to reach the front page that often, but they are constantly ongoing and bubbling away. There's lots of reasons. There's problems in Paris in terms of pension plans, pension age being raised. There's problems there in terms of the normalisation, the issue they have with their immigration and illegal immigration, and plans about recognising illegal immigrants and giving them citizenship. And people who are native French people are not happy with this because of the impact this is going to have upon social welfare in their country. So they've got all these problems here. With the farmers, there's probably subsidy issues and things like that, and challenges around the EU and nations not adhering to their limits and all that sort of thing. But regardless of those reasons, this is a problem for Macron in France to deal with. Now, in the Middle East, the Houthis continue to oversize their impact on the global stage. They, as I say, they're a great example of asymmetric warfare, with a few missiles, a few speedboats, and some guys with some automatic weapons. They are having a massive impact. The reports are that a British oil tanker, the Marlin Luanda, yesterday was struck by a anti-ship missile. It's the Trafigura. It's owned or operated by Trafigura Corporation. It was carrying Russian naphtha. Naphtha is a petroleum product and like an oil type of product, which is used in the manufacture of kerosene and petrol, or as Americans call it, gasoline. It was sailing under a Marshall Islands flag. The US military has come out and confirmed this attack. This one did happen. The boat is on fire. The US military has said that Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists fired one anti-ship ballistic missile from Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen and struck the Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker. Marshall Islands are up in the northeastern Pacific area. A Houthi military spokesman, Yahya Sarea, has said that the Houthis, they used appropriate naval missiles. The strike was direct. The ship reportedly issued a distress call and reported damage. No injuries have been reported, thankfully. And other coalition ships have responded and are rendering assistance. The reports are that or Trafigura, the company who was managing the ship, reports that the tanker was carrying Russian oil bought at below the price cap, they were saying, in line with the G7 sanctions. Whether that is the case or not, I don't know. It's interesting. It's got Russian oil on it. However, I think because the Houthis have said explicitly that they will not target Russian or Chinese ships. They've actually said they won't target any ships other than US, UK and Israeli affiliated ones. And they then specifically called out that Russian and Chinese ships will not be targeted. In this case, I think they don't care if it's got Russian oil on it, because this Russian oil has been bought by someone else. I'm assuming that this may have been headed to Europe or possibly Israel, but I think the Houthis not concerned that the product came from Russia. The Russians have already been paid for this oil. The impact will be upon this company, which is considered to be and this British oil tanker, because they will be paying the insurance fees and they'll be paying for the loss of the product. There are also reports that the Houthis are using wooden decoys for missiles, building wooden decoys, painting them up, placing them in positions, rolling them around, having guys go to them and tend them and all that sort of thing to make them appear to the US and UK surveillance as if they are targets, and causing the US to waste missiles in striking these. I don't know how successful that is. I'm not an expert in the US and UK's ability to analyse satellite imagery and determine if a target is a real target or if it's wooden. I imagine visually it would look pretty good, and even if it was maybe wrapped in foil, it might appear to some other sensors to be metallic, send back a metallic signal, and you might go, looks like a missile, we'll take it out. If they are working, again, great asymmetric warfare. Suck up a $2 million missile with a tree trunk, effectively, if it's working. I don't know if it's working, but I imagine it could work. The Chinese position on the Houthis. Foreign Ministry spokesman Mao Ning has said, "We call for an end to the harassment of civilian vessels in order to maintain the smooth flow of global production and supply chains and the international trade order." What the Chinese don't do here is harshly criticise the Houthis for what they are doing. Mao Ning reportedly added that the top priority, however, so while they do call for an end to the harassment of civilian vessels, the top priority, however, is the end of the war in Gaza as quickly as possible. So the Chinese position here is, yes, Houthis, we understand you, we've heard you, we know why you are doing this, and we agree with you. The top priority is to end the war in Gaza. If that were ended, that would in effect end the Houthis' attack on these UK, US and Israeli ships through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. The Commerce Ministry in Beijing is also calling on all actors in the region, again, not just targeting the Houthis, all actors in the region to restore and ensure the safety of waterways in the Red Sea. China has refrained from any military action against the Houthis, unlike the US and the UK. And as I said, the Houthis have said explicitly that the Chinese and the Russians, their ships can travel unimpeded. They didn't just say the Chinese and Russian, they said all other nations, including, then they called out specifically China and Russia. Now, this will have an impact on China to some extent, because it is increasing costs for shipping in general. Because shipping, if it wants to go through the Red Sea, it has to increase its insurance costs. If it wants to avoid the Red Sea, it's got to travel further, and that's increasing its costs. And so obviously a bulk of the world's goods are probably being shipped out of China, and a lot into China, because they are such a mass exporter and producer of goods. So it's having some impact, but it's like an indirect impact. And so at this stage, they seem to be relatively okay. They're just asking for everyone to calm things down. They're certainly not going after the Houthis or blaming the Houthis directly. It's interesting. In Gaza, reports that medical facilities at the largest remaining functioning hospitals in Gaza are collapsing. This is coming from Médecins Sans Frontières. Intense fighting around Khan Yunis has been reported. They are suggesting that most of the staff at the NASA hospital, along with thousands of displaced people sheltering in the hospital, have fled in the days leading up to the evacuation order by the Israeli Defense Forces. The European Gaza hospital is unreachable for medical staff because its neighbouring areas are under evacuation order. And the NASA hospital in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza has experienced a complete power outage. Now, what is really bad about this is that this is in southern Gaza. So this is after the Israelis bombed all of northern Gaza and forced everyone to the south. Now they're bombing southern Gaza and destroying all the hospitals there. As of yesterday, at least 26,000 people in Gaza, most of them kids and women, have been killed by the Israelis. Nearly 65,000 have been wounded. As I say, the majority of these are kids and women. I don't know how this makes you feel. It's not good anywhere that this happens. It's not good if Israeli kids are being killed. It's not good if any kids are being killed. This is just not good stuff. This is something we need to be moving away from, figuring a way to get away from this. What Israel is doing is not good. The International Court of Justice ruling, Antonio Guterres has said that he hopes Israel will comply with the International Court of Justice ruling in the case against Israel. The court has demanded that Israel must try to contain death and damage in its military offensive in the enclave, which is home to over 2.3 million people. However, it fell short of ordering a ceasefire in the area, which was the primary request of South Africa in bringing this to the ICJ. I have seen a number of people saying that even though it didn't go that far, that this is disastrous for Ukraine. Sorry, disastrous for Israel. I don't know why I've confused those two. Is disastrous for Israel. And it should be disastrous for Israel for this to be called out. But I will then go on to read a little bit about Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's response. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejects the ruling of the International Court of Justice and says Israel will continue to defend itself and its citizens. We will continue to do what is necessary to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has a basic right to defend itself. The World Court in The Hague justly rejected the outrageous demands to deprive us of this right. The mere claim that Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians is not only false, it's outrageous. And the willingness of the court to even discuss this is a disgrace that will not be erased for generations. Ben Gvir, who's the Minister of National Security of Israel, came out with a tweet which said, Hague Schmague. It was written in Hebrew, which I don't read, but I translated it and I saw people who had translated it. Basically, he has no concern for the court ruling here. And this is my concern, that while this should be a disastrous thing for Israel, that it may not be, and that Israel will just continue with this bombing and people, children, women will continue to die in Gaza. Right. That's it for today. I'm going to drink some more coffee and hang out with my kids. I hope you're having a good weekend. I am fortunate enough to have a public holiday tomorrow, so I will likely be back with another show for you tomorrow if you're interested. Talk to you soon.